Thank you so much. Can you hear me? There you go. All right, and thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to talk about one of the questions people ask me is, I don't know if all of you know, but I was actually a professional opera singer. I spent a chunk of my life doing opera as a career. And when they ask why did you change, one of the reasons is what I'm going to talk about now. The socioeconomic crisis that has sort of taken over my country the last 18 years is something that is deeply passionate, that I'm deeply passionate about, and it has changed my life to the point that I'm here in Cambridge studying about it now. And I guess it started with Hugo Chávez's election in 1998. I'm going to say it started, at least that's the point I'm going to start the story from. And at that point I was 12, so I just disclosed my age to you guys. It was a really contentious election and sort of divided the history of Venezuela in two, after Hugo Chávez and before Hugo Chávez. And arguably he also changed the landscape of the continent, right? A lot of politologists feel that Latin America moved towards the left after he was elected. He was sort of that first pariah, so to speak. And I grew up with that polarization, and in a way it led me away from Venezuela, where I grew up, and it sent me to the States in a way. The country was in such crisis that I couldn't really be a musician in Venezuela safely or lucratively, I guess. And despite the current crisis, which is even more horrible than anything I could have imagined when I left Venezuela in 2005, and just to give you an idea, I don't know how familiar you are with the news and what's been going on right now, but just in the past 6 months, Venezuelan inflation has gone up 700%. Venezuela has no capacity to feed its people, basically. We basically import 95% of our food, and we're not able to do that since the oil prices crashed, and Venezuela has never been able to diversify their economy. Unfortunately, it's not able to feed its people or cure them, so the whole hospital system is down. And I won't get into that. We can get into that in the question time, because I'm going to look at specifically the popularity of Hugo Chávez. And the reason is that despite this horrifying crisis that you've all heard about, Maduro's popularity, who is the current president of Venezuela and who Chávez left as a successor, is around 20%. Now, 2 out of 10 Venezuelans look at this crazy situation and think, I like Maduro, I think he's doing a good job. So it comes to show that we have misunderstood a lot of what his popularity is for, because, and I'll get that later on, but one of the first things that I noticed, and this is the slide, or what got me into this topic of understanding what the real popularity or reason for his popularity was this case of Jorge Tortosa. So he was a photographer and he worked for the opposition media, and there were very strong riots in 2003, and the military in that year deposed Chávez, and 3 days later they reinstated him again to, our particular chagrin, but anyway. He came back to power, and during those riots, Jorge Tortosa was killed, and he's a particularly special figure because he was used by both camps, so by the opposition camps and by the pro-government camps, to represent them as a sort of martyr. And Robert Samet, who is an anthropologist who was in Venezuela trying to figure out what had happened to him and trying to discover more about his case, said in passing, so this is in talking about his case, that Tortosa would have been taken as a Chavista because, and I quote, his dark skin and his working class background. Now, that was just a comment that he let in passing, but to me, that was a really profound question. What does it mean that he was probably a Chavista because he was dark-skinned? What does it mean that he was a working class background person? How are those things correlated? Why would that make him a Chavista? So, to look at that more in depth, I guess, we need to understand a concept of, or we need to go back to what racism is in Venezuela. It's a very contentious topic in Venezuela because, as I say, racism is practiced in subtle ways, but Venezuelans don't agree. They all think that Venezuela isn't a country where racism is practiced. And I'm going to explain that more clearly in this talk, but essentially, if we look at a soap opera, I'm going to put a funny example, or any music video, the characters that are always the protagonists in these soap operas, or the love interests, are always going to be European looking. But Europeans actually, or European looking people in Venezuela, only represent about 20% of Venezuela's population. In the capital, it's a bit more than that, it's about 30%. And most people sort of look like me, I guess. And what that means, in a way, is that people think when you ask them about racism, they say, no, there's no racism in Venezuela. And you ask them why, and they're like, well, no, we're not like the U.S. We don't have institutional segregation. We're all mixed. We all have a different background. And I'll talk about this mixed characteristics of Venezuelan in a bit. The other reason why this topic has also been completely abandoned in the political science of understanding his popularity is because people have also internalized these sort of pejorative characteristics that have been associated for centuries to Black and Indigenous, and that has meant that they feel a rejection of those origins and want to adopt this new sort of mestizo, which is inherently wider as well, identity. And there is this idea, and this explains a lot of not only Venezuela, but of the whole of Latin America's racial paradigm. So mestizaje is a concept I'm going to look at now. It's a very interesting picture of the three big ethnic, so to speak, groups that came to the Americas. The ideology of mestizaje is, and I love this because it's a card in Cards Against Humanity, the mixing of the races. This is basically what it is, and it's a card in Cards Against Humanity. But basically, because of the idea that we're all mixed, Venezuelans think that it means nothing to be of different ethnicities, or we're not really different ethnically because we're all the same. We're all mixed. We all have European, Indigenous, and African ancestry. And simply asking about race in Venezuela is kind of taboo. It's really contentious. I mean, there wasn't any data on any kind of racial census from 1871 to 2001. That's the point there. It was a project of grouping, so it was a project of national identity. And Venezuela sees itself throughout the 20th century as a patria café con leche, which means like coffee and milk nation. So where everybody's mixed, but however, a lot of scholars studying not the political side of things, but maybe the more beauty and beauty paradigms in Latin America feel that more milk is always better than more coffee. And so what does this mean for everyday lives Venezuelans? Well, we have to go back to the colonial context. Now, it's really important to explain because what a lot of people don't know is that the Spaniards and the Portuguese brought to the Spanish and Portuguese Americas 15 times more African slaves than what was brought to the U.S. So our constitutions are about 60 to 70% Afro-descendant, which is a very different case from the U.S. We don't hear much about racism in Latin America. We hear a lot more about racism as a minority in Western countries, right? So what happened? Well, there was a specific two things, biological constraints. And what I mean by that is that when Spanish came, they didn't come with their families. They were predominantly male immigrants. They came by themselves, and predominantly poor, and they were trying to get new land, which was different from what happened in the U.S., which was more family-oriented immigration. And Spaniards sort of rationalized their domination, I put that, by saying that blacks had no soul. They also said things like their soul needed to be saved. And so they promoted the idea of miscegenation very strongly in the Hispanics and the Portuguese Americas, very differently from the U.S. case, right? As I say there, by the 19th century, more than 60% in Venezuela's case was Afro-descendant. And I make the specificity because we really can't generalize across the countries. Very easy to say Latin America, but they're very different countries. In the case of Brazil, Venezuela, Cuba, to some extent Dominican Republic, were the largest groups of African slaves that were imported. The reason for that is that we had very small indigenous populations. So because the Spaniards needed people to air the land, those were the countries that had smallest indigenous populations, so they brought the largest amounts of African slaves to compensate. So what did Mestizaje do? How did Mestizaje get into the national conscience of Venezuelans? So these nation states, these new countries that were independent from Spain during the independence wars in the early part of the 19th century up to 1820, had this idea that they were going to be the mestizos. They needed a sort of identity that was different from Spain. So the idea that they were miscegenated, that they were mixed, that they were of three races was interesting to them and provided them a way to set difference from what had happened in Spain. But in reality, it failed to give the people that were a majority dark-skinned sort of a social and a cultural value. And the reason was that because those that were whiter and fair-skinned were actually not landowners. So those that had landowners were the ones that eventually had more power, and it cemented this deep inequality that has continued basically to this day. Venezuela in particular, and I didn't say this about the colonies, but the colonies had a stratified race system. So it's also one of the reasons why it was so important to reject that as nation countries. You know, people were classified by how much white they had in their blood. So if you were white, you were white. And if you were white born in Americas, you were still considered white. And if you were white with an Indian, you had a specific name, pardo. If you were white with black, you had a specific name, you were mulatto. And every single category of those mixtures that you can imagine had a specific name. So in the 1920s to 30s, Venezuela's income and its whole state was revolutionized. So it's changed the landscape. And basically it discovered oil. This huge increase in state revenue, politicians like to call it like the creation of the modern state, at least in Venezuela, right? So we can think of the 1920s as a time where the government and the state had enough power over their citizenry that they were thinking about the policies that they were going to give their citizens, so like healthcare, education. It's the first time they started thinking about the welfare state. And that promoted this sense that everyone was equal, that everyone had a chance. There was the social mobility sort of loosened, and everyone felt that they had the opportunity, that really this discourse was true. However, you can see historically that at that same time there was a ban on non-white immigration. So what does that mean? It simply meant that the president said, if you're not European, you can't immigrate to Venezuela. And he specifically promoted European immigration, and after the Second World War, there was a huge number, so 1 million Spanish, Portuguese, and Italians that came to Venezuela to settle and to work in the country. And that completely changed the demographics of Caracas, which is why I say we have a larger number of European-looking people in Caracas than to the rest of the country. So how does that fit in with Hugo Chávez? So Hugo Chávez attempted a coup against the president. Carlos Andrés Pérez was his name in 1989. And he was voted in 1989, the coup was in 1992. But the whole idea was, and I'm not sure you've heard this or not, but the 1990s pushed a sort of neoliberal agenda towards orthodoxy. Basically, Venezuela's revenue crashed. There was an oil crash as well. This is a recurring story, right? There was a huge decrease in public expenditure. The government increased the price of the gasoline, and that's a no-no in Venezuela. Venezuelans feel entitled to have cheap gasoline, and still now, our gasoline is cheaper than water, actually. This is true. So at that point, there was a need to break with the established political system, and Chávez was promoting a new constitution. He wanted to completely break with the past. He was a complete outsider. And he was elected into office in 1998. But, as we'll see in a bit, these are the theories that explain it. Those theories don't exactly explain why they would choose him. Yes, they explain, so I'll go through them. The first one is economic voting theory. So as I explained, there was a huge economic crisis. GDP per capita reduced about 25%, so that's a lot. And people were willing to accept this high risk, of a complete switch of parties. You take, and this is a political theory called prospect theory that says, when you are in a position of loss, so because people felt they were in a position of loss, they were more willing to take these high-risk candidates. And that's something that we can talk about what's happening now in the West, but it was definitely the case in 1998. There are structuralist theories that talk about the weak institutions in Latin America, and specifically in Venezuela, this idea of oil being the only source of revenue that our country has, meant that it entrenched inequality in that because oil was so important, it sort of created these power structures where only those that had access to the circle of oil were very rich, and cemented this sense of corruption. And where did all this money go, and how was it controlled? There's another idea that says that Venezuela had the longest running democracy in Latin America, so at that point, 40 years of democracy, and that people were feeling that they weren't participating enough in their government. And Chávez had a huge grassroots movement that really brought them in to participate. And as I say, his movement mobilized these marginalized groups. And so this theory thinks that his discourse really worked towards mobilizing these people to the vote in 1998. And that is a theory that more relates to what we're talking about, because it finally addresses his discourse, rather than think of the structural reasons for his popularity or what could have led people to vote for inequality. It explains why the choice of him, because all these candidates were anti-establishment, right? We hear a lot of people promise a lot of things, but why would they pick him? So this is a good reason. He did a lot of grassroots stuff. Now, one of the most, full explanations or complete explanations is this normative theory by Kirk Hawkins, and he talks about there being a crisis of legitimacy. So if you can imagine there's a country that depends entirely on oil, and the entire population feels that it's a very rich country, and you feel that the government is responsible for distributing that money and they haven't done it properly, then they're going to go for people that promise distribution of that money. And so his idea is that there was a crisis at that point. They were sick of corruption. And this does make sense because he talked a lot about corruption, Chávez did, but unfortunately so did the other candidates. They were all sick of corruption. They were all anti-establishment. So again, it doesn't explain why he was the candidate in particular that they preferred. So Chávez was the first, and this is where 3 authors only in particular, and what my research is going to talk about, discuss the issue of race and class as a paradigm. So in Latin America, the entrenched inequalities have a big racial component. The odds of you being poor if you are dark-skinned are extraordinarily high. And unfortunately, we don't have any specific data on that, which I will hopefully try and get in these 3 years that I have in PhD. But we have that data for other countries, and the correlation is extraordinarily high. And in in Brazil, they confirmed that if you were dark-skinned, and if you self-identified as dark-skinned, then if there were more than 3 candidates in the ballot, then you would vote for someone that looks like you in terms of race. So that's an important finding that we could sort of apply if we could recreate that experiment in Venezuela. It might give us clues as to whether or not people voted because Chávez looked like them, because he looked like the majority of Venezuelans. He was the first dark-skinned president to win, and he himself called himself these very specific racial terms. He said, I am Indio, which is indigenous, right? Mestizo, mixed of Negro, Zambo, which is indigenous and Negro. And he talked about there being a brown America utopia. So we've had a whole almost 2 centuries of this discussion that we're all equal, that we're all mixed. And here comes Chávez and says, no, actually, I am indigenous. I have African roots. I'm very proud of them. And he feels that this race and the working class for him has a color. We are this concept of the brown people. There's another author called Cannon who does a contentious claim, or has a contentious claim, or at least says 64% of Venezuelans or more. Now this is, we can talk about this more in the questions, but these are the people that self-identify as dark-skinned in Venezuela, 64%. Correlates to the 62% that voted for him, and that Cannon feels is quite significant, or he feels that that's not a coincidence. There's something to look at into there. We can't really say, right, that wouldn't be scientific, but at least there's a clue, and nobody studied it, so why not? So there's one very important quote that I'll read. And this is what Chavez says in 2005 about racism. And he says, "Hate against me has a lot to do with racism because of my big mouth, because of my curly hair, and I'm so proud to have this mouth and this hair because it is African." And that's explicitly taking racial terms and talking about race in a very specific way. It's never been done before in Venezuela. So I guess, I don't know how much time we still have. Yeah? Okay. These are basically the questions that I want to look at in my research. And, did his discourse, so I'd be looking at his discourse, did he engage with dark-skinned majority in the way he spoke? And we have clues towards that, which is what I showed you. And does it play a role in the political identity? So when people see Chavista, do they think, when they see a dark-skinned person, do they immediately think he's a Chavista? And I'm sort of an outlier because I see myself as dark-skinned, but at the same time, I was never a Chavista. So how did that happen? Why is that the case? Has the media presented Chavismo supporters as racialized subjects? And I have a picture in the next slide. And have dark-skinned Venezuelans been excluded at all levels or just at some levels? And the reason for that is that, as I say, he's the first dark-skinned president, and yet the majority of Venezuelans are dark-skinned. So how has that happened? You can see this very racialized image of Chavez down here. An exaggeration of his lips, an exaggeration. Well, he's actually portrayed as a monkey. So there's a lot of racism that's very clear from the opposition side towards him, right? They picture him as someone who's very brute, someone who looks like a monkey, who's uneducated, and these are stereotypes that are being fed into the population. And then the one on top says, "Enough of white supremacy, now we have Afro-descendant water," because there was a big problem with the water, and the water was black in Venezuela that came out of the taps. So that's sort of to show that racism is a thing. Although people deny it in Venezuela, there's a need to go there and to talk about these with people, create focus groups. So, don't know if yeah. Any case, these were the three things that I plan to do in my PhD. So, I'm going to look at a historic account of why there's been political leadership that has been white, a discourse analysis of his talks, and he talked a lot. Spent 8 hours talking on Sundays every day, a lot of talking, and then an interesting survey that would cross-reference your vote choice with your self-identification. So if you identify itself, so sort of the similar what they did in Brazil. So yeah, these are some of the contributions that I open it up to the floor. Cheers. Thank you. I'll leave it here, I guess.
Questions?
I thought it was a really fascinating presentation, and I can relate to it a lot in terms of like the race, identity, and politics of it from where I come from, Sudan. I suggest a kind of a reconceptualization of your use of the term race or racism. Because the way I see it, you're looking at three interlinked, interconnected aspects of the whole racism, like interface. And I think the three categories I would like encourage looking at is the element of not so much as a race connected to skin color, but race as tracing ancestral descent. So where people come from, how they intermarry, the tribes, the indigenous and so on. So a question of descent rather than race or skin color, because you had intermarried. And the second question could be just the sense of racial consciousness, that people think because we are racially conscious, therefore we are not racist. So that could be an argument. The third one is blatant racism, basically saying, like, yes, the water is polluted, it is black, therefore Africa. That's amazing. But I think like looking at these three aspects would bring out a kind of a deeper reflection of why people don't see racism. It's just the way they conceptualize.
It's very interesting what you say first about looking at, and this is a book that I read, and I wish they would have done the study in Venezuela. Unfortunately, they chose Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. But what this author argued was for the use of skin color instead of race in Latin America. It was very contentious because he even used this chart of different colors. And he asked the people that were evaluating and that were taking the survey for the interviewer to choose a category that he thought the person belonged to, because race is not only what you self-identify, but also what other people see you as, right? So there, what it meant was that when we define our race in terms of names and in terms of Afro-descendant or indigenous, the correlation between inequality and your race doesn't show up very clearly, because those terms in Venezuela are all mixed. We don't really know. So if you see me, I look Indian, but I could look indigenous, but like my nose is a bit, so you wouldn't be able to type, and at this point, after 200 years that's happened, there's been so much racial mixture. It's very difficult to, we don't know even what the tribes, the specific tribes that came from Africa were. And the indigenous populations have been really, really, so it's very difficult to, in an ethnic sense, if you define ethnicity as like where your culture defines you, then it's very difficult to define it. So skin color, rather, when he did that, pigmentocracies, he called the book, he realized that the correlation was completely there. So I wish I could, I won't show you because the case isn't Venezuela, but it was very obvious that actually skin color is how Latin Americans have been able to look at others rather than through their race. So it's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just following up that, I wonder it's not about identifying yourself as a particular race, because he has intersectionality about that, but it's rather saying, I am not white, I am not the colonial master, I am not the traditional side of power, right?
Yeah.
And then that's in a particular context in the late 1990s, US, etc. So, I mean, I read lots of leftist literature. So what I had read about Hugo Chávez was the linkage to Morales, what's happening in Brazil. I mean, so I'm just wondering, I mean, so we would view him as the indigenous African, opponent to these white kind of colonial descendants that have these decision-making positions. So how does, I'm just curious to kind of open that discussion up, if it's either about saying I'm not this, as well as all these things, but I'm not that, actually, and it's that negative that is the strength.
It's interesting because I haven't been able to find an instant where he says, I'm not white, or they don't seem to use that term white. He always goes to the brown pueblo, and so the opponents are always his political opponents, and he doesn't define them as white, but he does talk about them as, the corrupt, the elites, the US, he talks a lot, obviously, about the CIA, about intervention, and he never racializes his opponent. He just bunches them up as this evil. But still, I mean, he's talked so much that there might be somewhere, there are at least 10 volumes. There is. I think so, yeah. There's there. That's very interesting. Yeah. Paul.
So how does the opposition now view themselves then? Have they switched their rhetoric as well? Have they gone from emphasizing their connection to, say, a European ancestor to now emphasizing, no, we're more, or emphasizing like Chavez did, that no, I'm mixed, I have African background, I have indigenous background. How has their rhetoric been matched in the, almost 20 years since he came?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think this is one of the failures, that they haven't been able to address that, because they haven't seen it. As I say, only he really saw this as a confrontation, that he was from this brown identity. So all the opposition has done, and this is there are tons of little opposition parties that have been conglomerated into this MUD, which is just a unity table, it's called, of democracy. And this unity of democracy, the only thing that they all have in common is the opposition to Chavez. And that isn't enough, right? That isn't enough to move a number of people. Actually, they've been very fortunate that the Chavistas have done such a bad job that in 2016, just now, the parliament is now in favor of the opposition. But a clever thing would be, or for the opposition to actually address this issue, that there is an issue of representation, as you say, that they haven't. But they don't want to go to those terms of whiteness and blackness. But it would be smart if they could see themselves as well as this ethnic, pluricultural, which they haven't done. They just haven't done. And I think this is one of the reasons why some people might say, no, I just don't want to vote for anyone. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Great presentation. I have two questions. First, when you talked about the moment that it's kind of
did the join up change after the elections? How was like, did something lead up to it? Because what I'm thinking about is it's not a juncture. Like is that sort of a disjuncture in that moment, or is it something in terms of continuity? How does that lead up to it? And second, you talked about class and race, about how he basically interacted with working class and tied race very categorically with it. I also was wondering, how does gender come into this? Like, was the vote bank mostly masculine? Does the working class have ties with, I don't know what the division is in terms of how many women, men, how does that integrate?
Yeah, Venezuela still doesn't have the first female president or very strong female leaders. Female leaders are very strong, and sociologists talk about this, like this matriarchal in Latin America, at least in Venezuela, society where there is a parental figure that leaves very quickly. So the majority of Venezuelans have a dad that left at some point in their lives and goes back to the mom. And this is a recurring theme, especially in the lower stratas, let's say. In terms of, okay, let me see, yes, no, it wasn't an entire break with Chavez, right? The president that came right before him was the first one who broke with the two-party system. So for those 40 years of democracy that I talked about, without getting to too much historical detail, all the candidates and all the presidents were white. Right before he gets into power, there's one president that breaks the two parties and creates a new party. So that's the first step towards an anti-establishment sort of move. And he sets him free because he was put in jail for being a coup-monger. But this new president that created this new party essentially sets him free. And that is when they say that is the break of the two-party system. And Chavez, before then, no one still had talked about race, none at all. Chavez is the first one. And if you see all what I've gathered about his quotes, they're all after 2003. And there might be a reason for that, and I have to sort of dig into it more. But his first discourse isn't racial. I wouldn't say that in 1998 he was specifically addressing race. So race act, I think, we'll find out more about it, but there's a sociologist called, oh God, I forget his name. Okay, blank. But in any case, it talks about this sort of unconscious self-identification with someone, right, before you vote. So I think that's how it played in 1998. In 2004, he had a huge drop in his popularity, huge drop. That's what led to that riots that I talked about Tortosa's skin color. And that is also when he changed his rhetoric to be, I am a socialist of the 21st century. That's the first time that term came into use. And if you might have heard of him speaking of that. And that is also when he started speaking about this brown America. So there is some kind of link. There's some kind of, he twisted towards an extreme at that point where he saw his popularity go down so dramatically. Then it went up again. Yeah.
Like the last question, just no more. Sure. Any other questions you can ask afterwards.
I'm curious about the idea you mentioned from Cannon that there was maybe a correlation between the percent of people who voted for him and the percent of people who self-identify as darker skinned or mixed race. That suggests that data maybe doesn't actually exist if it's one guy speculating about it. So to what extent is that information available today in Venezuela in terms of race, self-identification, and how people vote? Because in the U.S. that is a huge thing. We talk about it all the time. But I think even as your supervisor was talking about the context of Mexico recently and how that is a very new concept in terms of gathering data on race.
Yeah, it's the same. So it's really it's really unfortunate. I think Mestizaje did help the Latin American countries not get involved with this sort of violent aggression that existed towards racism. But it at the same time it hid this protocol of how the power relations work in the country. And I think, unfortunately, because of that, people, as I say, they didn't want to mention race. So we don't have any census data until 2001. We do have some surveys, though. The most recent one is 2007. And that is where Cannon gets his data and where I say that 64 identify as dark-skinned. And in Venezuela, the term is a bit, they say morenos. And so Morenos is also a huge gamut of skin color, which is why this guy that I spoke about pigmentocracies tried to objectify a little bit further in a very contentious way this color of skin, because morenos can really mean a lot of things. And there's moreno oscuro, which means like dark moreno. And so the 64 is the morenos and the dark morenos, basically. So that's where he gets his data. And then 64 is also people that belong to the D and E strata. I didn't say that. But out of the 5, the D and E strata are also that 62. So it's very, very close. Those who identify with Chávez at that point, those who are dark-skinned, and those who belong to D and E stratas. So okay.
We'll save it afterwards. Let's think about it one time.